Nos vijf daar. Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome, particularly to the High Sheriff, the Mayor, AM, and any other dignitaries I don't know particularly, but welcome everyone. You will have seen the programme already. If you haven't, then it's a brilliant description of what this lecture is going to be about. But it's also another good description because it starts off by saying that Shakespeare has written about many Welsh people, and particularly, of course, Owen Glyndŵr, who is depicted in Henry IV, Part 1. He is described as a warrior, bombastic to an extent, prone to exaggeration and fancy, but who is also seen as a man of integrity, warmth, hospitality, and a love for his family and friends. That is also Professor Mike Scott, writ large. He is family and friends to all of us, and just like Owen Glyndŵr, is a fighter and is determined at this crucial moment in the development of this great university to continue that fight for the good of Wrexham, North East Wales, and the whole universe, if you like, because he is a big thinker. Mike has never been known for thinking small. Thank heavens, neither did Shakespeare, neither did Owen Glyndŵr. If, like me, you would go into the confessional and admit that you really never got on with Shakespeare as a child, you could never bear learning all those long soliloquies and all the rest, then tonight we're in for a treat because he will open our eyes about him. He's almost a fellow countryman of Shakespeare from that sort of country in the middle of Britain called Black or something. And he can do the Shakespearean accent, or was it that Shakespeare did yours? I'm not sure. But one way or the other, Mike is born bred in that area, which probably explains that he is a Shakespearean scholar in origin. And unlike most vice-chancellors, nay, nearly all vice-chancellors, he has not committed academic suicide on becoming a vice-chancellor because he's retained his real research interest in Shakespeare. And recently, on a short sabbatical period, had a further time at Oxford to do a little further research on it. That is, as I say, rare for a vice-chancellor. But you know just as well as I do, and probably better, that he is a rare vice-chancellor in any case, fitting that great description in here. And therefore it's my very great pleasure to welcome Michael to the podium to give us his professorial address. I was nearly going to say his inaugural address. I think he's done one, but he'll do one nearly every year, given half a chance. So let's give a warm welcome to Professor Mike Scott as he delivers his inaugural on Shakespeare, Owen Glyndŵr, and this great university. Michael.
Diolch yn fawr. Let me begin with probably Shakespeare's most famous play, Hamlet, and the first soliloquy. Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw and resolve itself into a dew. Oh, that the everlasting had not fixed his canon against self-slaughter. Oh God, how weary, stale, flat and unprofitable seem to me all the uses of this world. Fie on it. Oh, fie. 'Tis an unweeded garden that grows to seed. Things rank and gross in nature possess it merely. That it should come to this, but 2 months dead, nay, not so much, not 2. So excellent a king that was to this Hyperion to a satyr, so loving to my mother that he might not beteem the winds of heaven visit her face too roughly. Heaven and earth must I remember. Why, she would hang on him as if increase of appetite had grown by what it fed on. And yet, within a month, let me not think on's frailty thy name is woman. A little month, or ere those shoes were old with which he followed my poor father's body like Niobe all tears. Why she, even she, O God, a beast that once discourse of reason would have mourned longer. Married with my uncle, my father's brother, but no more like my father than I to Hercules. Within a month, ere yet the salt of most unrighteous tears had left the flushing in her gauntlet eyes, she married. Almost wicked speed to post with such dexterity to incestuous sheets. It is not, nor it cannot come to good. But break my heart, for I must hold my tongue. As the first soliloquy, this speech sets the tone for a play in which we are led in many performances, and maybe in traditional readings of the text, to form an affinity or empathy with the protagonist. As the play goes on, in the context of a sympathetic interpretation, the reader or playgoer engages with the fortunes of the principal character until, following Hamlet's death, at the end of the tragedy, Prince Fortinbras delivers the following lines. Let 4 captains bear Hamlet like a soldier to the stage, for he was likely, had he been put on, to have proved most royally, and for his passage the soldier's music and the rites of war speak loudly for him. Take up the bodies, such a sight as this becomes the field, but here shows much amiss. Go, bid the soldiers shoot. What I want to question briefly at the start of this paper is whether the action of the play from that first soliloquy to the end and that statement by Fortinbras that Hamlet, if he had lived, would have proved most royally, or was indeed like a soldier, is that justified? Soldiers take orders, or if they're officers, they give them. Hamlet, throughout the play, procrastinates. If we believe that royals engage in mass murder of their own families, as in 20th century Nepal, then that's what Hamlet does. My research is concerned with what we call cultural transformation. And I come from a line of literary critics who deconstruct the norm. They look at the pieces. In Charles Marowitz's terms, you think of Hamlet as a great vase, and you take the vase and you drop it on the floor, and it smashes. Then you pick up the pieces and you recreate the vase, not necessarily in the same shape as it was before. I don't ask, in my line of criticism, what plays mean. I ask how they work, and how they work differently through a variety of cultural interpretation. A cultural interpretation which can change the play from century to century, year to year, day to day, even hour to hour. Now, tonight, I'm not going to go into a deconstructionist lecture on Hamlet. But for those of you who know the play, I would just like to think about the structure and the truth of its narrative in relation to the sympathetic interpretation that tends to dominate an empathetic relationship between the audience or reader and the character. To do this, let's just do a little deconstruction by doing what is comically sometimes seen as the unforgivable. Let's take Hamlet out of Hamlet and consider information that the political narrative of this play gives, that comes through the story of the play, without having the encumbrance of the character of Hamlet there. So what is the story without Hamlet? Hamlet's father, we learn, was a warlord who defeated the Norwegians. Strong man. The king of Norway is now old, but the prince of Norway, Fortinbras, who's his nephew, has assembled an army to invade Denmark to wreak revenge on what King Hamlet had done. And he's done this without the knowledge of the old king of Norway. The king of Denmark, Hamlet's father, Hamlet, has died in a garden, whilst Prince Hamlet has been away at the university in Wittenberg, which happens to be the home university, of course, of Martin Luther. But that's an incidental, and only something that might strike some people as interesting if they knew that that was the case, because he doesn't say anything about Luther. In the face of impending war, the dead king's brother, Claudius, has assumed the throne and subsequently declared his brother's son, young Hamlet, the university student, as his heir. He has also married his brother's wife, Gertrude, the mother of the proclaimed heir, and has thereby given the country stability at a time of crisis, a little like Henry VII marrying Elizabeth of York. It gives us stability. Hamlet has returned for the funeral, but has been refused permission to return to university. So we brought him back slightly into the play. Further, Claudius, the new king, has sent ambassadors to Denmark with messages that prove fruitful in ensuring that the war-hungry Prince Fortinbras of Norway does not, in fact, invade Denmark, but instead he invades Poland. Peace, then, has been assured for Denmark because of the political acts of Claudius, and partying has begun. Everybody is celebrating. They've got peace. A dangerous period has been overcome through political astuteness. War is avoided, and everyone is happy. That's the narrative. Except, that is, for Hamlet, who we now restore to the play. Hamlet admits that he's not a Herculean warrior like his father was. Indeed, he is a student, and he has students' friends. He is upset by his mother's marriage, which he regards as being incestuous. That's an interesting point, in that it's exactly what Henry VIII thought about his own marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the widow of his brother Arthur, though it took Henry VIII about 20 years to get to that point. Anyway, he's upset, Hamlet. Hamlet is upset about this incestuous marriage. And lo and behold, he sees a ghost, and this ghost identifies himself as the old King Hamlet, and then that old King Hamlet ghost accuses his brother, now king, of his murder. Hamlet immediately declares that he knew something was wrong, that something had occurred which was untoward, and immediately vows to murder the new king on the basis of seeing a ghost and having a sexual hang-up about his mother's relationship with his uncle. Now he's back in the play. He directly causes the death of the king's most trusted minister, Polonius, by killing him. Indirectly causes the death of Polonius' daughter, Ophelia, whom he loves, and of his own mother, Queen Gertrude, as well as two of his student friends, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, though Claudius is implicit in that as well. He enrages Ophelia's brother Laertes because of the death of Polonius and Ophelia, and then kills him in a duel, having first, however, received a wound himself, which is proved to be fatal because the sword has been poisoned. But as he's dying, he still has enough in him to successfully kill King Claudius. With the whole royal family dead, he has left the kingdom to be ruled by whom? A foreigner. Which one? Prince Fortinbras of Norway, who has come to give his greetings to the court. The very prince whom Claudius had made sure was not going to invade Norway at all. Hamlet is royal indeed, if that's the kind of person that you would like as the leader of your nation. If we continue this deconstruction, it might lead us to a more alienating interpretation of the play in relation to a malcontented prince who is so wrapped up in himself, in his adolescence, that all he wants to do from the start is to destroy King Claudius and anybody else for that matter. Let me read the speech again. Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew. Or that the everlasting had not fixed his cannon against self-slaughter. Oh God, how weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable seem to me all the uses of this world. Fie on it, fie. 'Tis an unweeded garden that grows to seed. Things rank and gross in nature possess it merely. That it should come to this, but 2 months dead? Nay, not so much, not 2. So excellent a king that was to this Hyperion to a satyr. So loving to my mother that he might not beteem the winds of heaven visit her face too roughly. Heaven and earth, must I remember? Why, she would hang on him as if increase of appetite had grown by what it fed on. And yet within a month, let me not think of it. Frailty, thy name is woman. A little month, or ere those shoes were old, with which she followed my poor father's body like Niobe, all tears. Why, she, even she, oh God, a beast that once discourse of reason would have mourned longer, married with my uncle, my father's brother, but no more like my father than I to Hercules, within a month. Ere yet the salt of most unrighteous tears had left the flushing in her galled eyes, she married. Oh, most wicked speed, to post with such dexterity to incestuous sheets. It is not, nor it cannot come to good. But break my heart, for I must hold my tongue. Same words, same words. A deconstructionist interpretation of Hamlet can actually make him a Machiavellian troublemaker, malcontent from the start. Although citing Cain and Abel, Claudius later confesses in Act 3 to the murder. He only does so in a soliloquy, made in an abortive attempt to find a reconciliation with God. So there is no tangible evidence for Hamlet, the character, to justify his murderous actions, except a play within a play or the words of a ghost. He can be considered in such a reading or interpretation as that dangerous malcontent right from the start. In being able to change the way in which even the first soliloquy is presented, I can begin, I hope, to demonstrate that Shakespeare's texts are fluid and that their meaning, therefore, is unreliable. Shakespeare doesn't mean, as Terry Hawkes tells us, we mean through Shakespeare. Through studying his work pragmatically, we discover the contradictory nature of meanings and purposes, and thereby come to an interpretation of philosophy and action in our own lives and the institutions that surround us, not specifically from the text, but from our personal readings of the text. Nonsense, you may argue. Go back to the original texts. Go back to them. And there you'll find the key to what Shakespeare really wanted to communicate. But I'm afraid that's no answer. Even the Shakespeare texts are unreliable as a stable guide to interpretation. For example, take the words that conclude Claudius's abortive prayers for forgiveness. This is the first edition of Hamlet. It's not the actual first edition, I hasten to add, but it is an expensive reproduction of it. It was published in 1603, and at the end of the king's prayer, the king says, "My words fly up, my sins remain below. No king on earth is safe if God's his foe." Take the Oxford Hamlet and have a look at the same lines, and you will see they say, "My words fly up, my thoughts remain below. Words without thoughts never to heaven go." Different. A different interpretation. No king on earth is safe if God's his foe. Words without thoughts never to heaven go. I would suggest that there's a difference there in interpretation about Claudius, an interpretation within the play. That's the first Hamlet. This is the Oxford Hamlet. The Oxford Hamlet has rejected the first Hamlet and has gone for the second quarto, 1604, because it feels, the editor, Stanley Wells, feels that that is what we call the bad quarto and couldn't have been by Shakespeare. He prefers this one. And therefore he publishes this one. And when did he do that? About 15 years ago. So, if you tell me to go back to the text, which text? I don't know. I don't know which text we're talking about. I've learned since coming to this university, by having the pleasure to talk to world-class technologists, my colleagues in science, that when you break down a solid into nanoparticles, you find that everything is moving, that there is nothing that is actually solid. It all moves about. And so it is with the deconstruction of Shakespearean texts, and possibly in our interpretation of historical figures such as Owen Glyndŵr, or indeed of our preconceptions and understanding of institutions themselves, such as universities. We look for stability at the core because everything around us seems to be stable. And we base our judgments on that stability. And indeed, we go further. We expound certainties. But in art, as in science, we are frustrated by the constancy which is found throughout. The constancy of movement, of things slipping away. Let me continue just a little more about the fluidities in the nature of Shakespearean interpretation before going on to talk a bit about education, then to the historical and fictional Owen Glendower as people interpret him, and then see, coming back to education, how these examples help us reference our historical and contemporary knowledge of the role and function of a university, and particularly one named after an iconic Welsh prince. In critical jargon, I'm moving my argument tonight along what's called a postmodernist deconstructionist path to find or confirm the identity, role, and purpose of Glendower University. A feature of a postmodernist edifice is the collocation, the bringing together of unlike references into an aesthetic unity. But that unity, because of the collocation of unlike references, is a challenging unity. The building, the artifact, challenges us through the references that are there that are making its whole. The title of this lecture is such a postmodernist title: Shakespeare, Owen Glendower, and the Future of the University. References that are not usually put together. The collocation is wrong, but in a postmodernist line of criticism, I hope we get to it some conclusions which form a unity. The question is whether there is any aesthetic or didactic point to such an activity. Why are you doing this? What's the point? But actually, going back to Shakespeare's Hamlet, in one interpretation, at least, of that play, Hamlet asks of himself a postmodernist question in his search for self-knowledge of what is and what will be in relation to the identity of an individual. Perhaps that is an individual, when deconstructed, is someone who has no stability of identity anyway, but is merely a conglomeration of dust particles in a living form. Perhaps we're getting to some pretty fundamental metaphysical issues here. In Act 2, Scene 2, talking with his curious university friends, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, he uses the word what to state rather than to question, and then uses it again in a rhetorical sense. What a piece of work is a man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, in form and moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. And yet, to me, what is this quintessence of dust? A contemporary writer of a certain school may see this as a postmodernist statement in asking, what is this being which is no more than a living collocation of particles or similes or references. Shakespeare, of course, wouldn't have even known the term postmodernism nor what it meant. The desire for symmetry or for the concept of order, or in George Eliot's Middlemarch, Casaubon's search for a key to all mythologies, has been imposed on Shakespeare through a history of literary criticism and theatrical production, in which age after age have in effect not interpreted Shakespeare, but have talked to themselves through his texts in order to find stable interpretations or meanings. For most ages, he has caused problems because his plays simply do not adhere to what the age certainly required. They slip away because they move from the outside, which looks solid, to the fluid of the nanoparticle within, leaving the greatest of philosophers in a quandary. Voltaire famously declared Shakespeare the English buffoon. In the 17th century, in fact, in 1681, Nahum Tate, regarding Shakespeare's plays as a house of unorganized treasures, decided that he would have to improve King Lear, much to Samuel Johnson's praise, the great Dr. Johnson. And so Tate rewrote it, so that at the end of the play, of this tragedy, neither King Lear nor Cordelia died. Cordelia married the man, the main part, and Lear was taken away in happiness to live with them ever after. That interpretation of King Lear lasted for 150 years or thereabouts. For 150 years, no one saw a production, as far as we know, a production of King Lear which ended in the death of Cordelia or of the king. It was restored to its original by Charles Macready in 1838, much to the approval of another great writer and thinker, Charles Dickens, who saw the first performance. Stability. Shakespeare. What does it all mean? I don't look for meanings. I don't look for meanings. The Romantic Age, of course, coming towards the end of that in 1838. In the early 19th century, delighted in a new freedom of expression, which glorified the poet-philosopher in society. And that Romantic Age began to deify Shakespeare within their own image and likeness. Schlegel in Germany and Samuel Taylor Coleridge in Britain, establishing the criteria of his greatness to be within the language. Basically, the Romantics, crudely, let me say, the Romantics believed that the poet was the greatest philosopher and that Shakespeare was the greatest poet that had ever lived. Therefore, Shakespeare was the greatest philosopher that had ever been. That's the simple interpretation. Over 100 years later, from the Schlegel and Coleridge in the early part of the 19th century, over 100 years later, nearly 130 years later, L.C. Knights, one of the great literary critics of the early 20th century, was still advocating the finer the poetry, the finer the play. Language. It was all to do with the poetry. finer the poetry, the finer the play. Bit difficult with a Beckett play, almost impossible with a Pinter play. The finer the silence, the finer the play. That was still going in the 1930s. In the 1940s, E.M.W. Tillyard led a trend in criticism based on what he termed the Elizabethan world order, expressed especially in the history plays. But his vision was actually a mid-20th century expression of an Elizabethan world order. Tillyard used a great speech to demonstrate the Elizabethan world order. It's a speech from Shakespeare's play Troilus and Cressida. It's a speech which demonstrated, as far as Tillyard was concerned, that that world order was set down in the Elizabethan age, that it's echoed or recorded by Shakespeare, that it's seen within the history plays which move from Henry VI, Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, Richard III, Henry IV, Part 1, Henry IV, Part 2, Henry V. Moving towards this great king, this iconic king. And this is the start of the Elizabethan order, the British order. Very good. Of course, he had to admit that actually the first play in that whole sequence to be written was Henry VI, Part 3. The second was Henry VI, Part 1. The third was Henry VI, Part 2. Then you had Richard III. Then you had Henry IV, Henry IV, Part 1, Henry IV, Part 2. So I think I said it the wrong way around myself earlier, but it goes in chronological order, Henry VI to Richard III. But the Henry VI plays are the wrong way round, chronologically. And then you get Henry IV, Henry V. So the idea that Shakespeare sat down and said, now I'm going to write the chronology of English historical kings in order to get to a point where I demonstrate that we moved to the great hero, the great iconic figure, the Winston Churchill of the medieval age, is a load of nonsense. But he based it on this. The heavens themselves, the planets and this centre observe degree, priority and place, insistia, course, proportion, season, form, office and custom, in all line of order, and therefore is the glorious planet's soul in noble eminence enthroned and sphered amidst the other, whose medicinable eye corrects the influence of evil planets, and posts like the commandment of a king sans check to good and bad. But when the planets in evil mixture to disorder wander, what plagues and what portents, what mutiny, what raging of the sea, shaking of the earth, commotion in the winds, frights, changes, horrors, divert and crack, rend and deracinate the unity and married calm of states, quite from their fixture. Oh, when degree is shaked, which is the ladder of all high designs, the enterprise is sick. How could communities, degrees in schools and brotherhoods in cities, peaceful commerce from dividable shores, the primogeniture and due of birth, prerogative of age, crowns, sceptres, laurels, but by degree stand in authentic place? Take but degree away, and tune that string, and hark what discord follows. Each thing meets in mere oppugnancy. The bounded waters should lift their bosoms higher than the shores and make a sop of all this solid globe. Strength should be lord of imbecility, and the rude son should strike his father dead. Force should be right, or rather right and wrong, between whose endless jars justice resides, should lose their names, and so should justice too. Then everything includes itself in power. Power into will, will into appetite, and appetite a universal wolf so doubly seconded with will and power, must make perforce a universal prey, and last eat up himself. Without order, the order of degree, the order of class, you would have a situation where society eats up himself. Dreadful. And that's it. That must be the Elizabethan world picture. Trouble is, it's in this play called Troilus and Cressida. And it's a Grecian lord that is speaking, whilst they're putting to death, or trying to put to death as many Trojans as they possibly can. It's in the middle of terrible war, and Tilliard is writing at the end of a terrible war. And how does this play end? This play ends actually with a speech by Pandarus, in which he bequeaths his venereal diseases to the audience. That's how the play ends. Take this out of context, and you can prove anything. Was this Shakespeare's ideology? Tilliard's has actually exposed his own ideology, or the ideology in which he works. Contemporary criticism has attacked Tilliard and other critics of the same historical persuasion over the last 50 years. But in doing so, they've tended to attack Tilliard and others. I've just taken him as an example, and others, and criticise them actually from their own ideological positions. The only difference is that they say Tilliard did it subliminally, but they expose their ideologies. They say on the first page, I am a Marxist. Boom. And therefore, I am going to attack from a Marxist position. And therefore, what you'll find is the truth. Or for that matter, I'm a Christian. Or whatever. Or I'm a Muslim. And I'm looking at it from my ideological position. Overtly to say what your ideological position doesn't mean to say that your interpretation is more real than the interpretation of Tilliard. You've just been a bit more transparent. He didn't have to be at the time. What I'm pointing out is that interpretation relies as much on the ideology of the reader, actor, player, director, as that of the dramatist. Plays, however, endure. In a volume of critical survey some years ago, I argued that the characters, incidents, poetry of the dramas are merely elements in a communication science system which we call a play, and through which we converse with ourselves. And this has been a constant theme of my work in books on John Marston, in a book on Renaissance drama and a modern audience, Shakespeare, another book, Shakespeare and the Modern Dramatist, and my latest project, which is called Shaping Up for Shakespeare. As with any communication science system or language, the danger is that he who speaks loudest dominates the meaning and the conclusion of the conversation. And those who in criticism or in education or in politics speak loudest are the ones who are heard first. We have to reflect, however, on what is being said and identify false symmetries and the constructed sense of the order of things. The universe itself and its order, based on E equals mc squared, has kept us within a certain stability for quite some time. But now scientists are all looking at what's happening and saying, is something capable of disproving E equals mc squared. The order of Ulysses is that of the 20th century European politicians and generals who decided that the First World War would end symmetrically on the 11th hour of the 11th month of 1918, whilst in the meantime soldiers could continue to be slaughtered. So what has all this to do with Owen Glendower and the future of the university? In my book, Talking Shakespeare, which I compiled with Deborah Cartmel and published for Macmillan Palgrave in 2001, I argued that Shakespeare's dramas operate on contradictory and complementary levels, leading us to become involved in meanings not necessarily related to the questions being asked. Leading us to become involved in meanings not necessarily related to the questions being asked. The problematic element here draws on what S.L. Bethel during the Second World War actually described as the multi-conscious apprehension of the audience. We impose more meanings on our interpretation of Shakespeare than actually come from him. And we do so as we watch the play or read them, conscious of our surroundings, feelings and thoughts over a range of issues. As you listen to me, you're conscious of the person who's sitting next to you. You're conscious of the person who might be in front of you. You're conscious of the person who might be dozing off to sleep. You're conscious of the person who's intent. You've got a multi-conscious apprehension of the lecturer. So it is in a theatre. You're conscious of other things, not just on what you're seeing. If all the world's a stage, as Jaques holds in Twelfth Night, and if theatre holds up a mirror to the world which the protagonist proposes in Hamlet, or if life's but a walking shadow in the context of the Scottish play, or if we are such stuff as dreams are made of, as stated by the character Prospero in The Tempest, then the ephemeral nature of drama is being seen and unseen in the context of claims that drama itself is a dim reflection of life, at which we are looking through a glass darkly, in the terms of St. Paul. Thus we get down to the nano-measurement of interpretation where meanings become fluid. Deconstructing Shakespeare has enabled us to challenge traditional assumptions in relation to the practical sphere or work in which I'm currently engaged. This is the development of education, particularly higher education in the early 21st century. The historical parallels between Shakespearean criticism and the movement in education generally through the 20th century are evident, though educational development tends to lag behind artistic movements. In 1911, the year in which my father was born, only 7% of the male population progressed to secondary education. And we don't even know a percentage for the female progression. Arguments were waged and are recorded, saying that only 7% was required to go into education because if more did so, who would be the servants, the labourers, the workers in the field and in the factory? Who would do all that job? The class system itself might break down. As W.S. Gilbert had humorously summed it up in The Gondoliers in 1889, when everybody is somebody, then nobody is anybody. And of course, it was precisely those nobodies denied schooling and some somebodies who had schooling, who were slaughtered on Flanders fields, or then in the next war in the Nazi gas chambers, or in the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The atrocities of 2 world wars in the first decades, in the first half of the 20th century. By the end of the 20th century, things had changed as far as schooling was concerned. It was then that Tony Blair advocated that 50% of 18-year-olds should go to university. And lo and behold, we had the similar complaints. Who will be the plumbers, the electricians, the decorators? Who's going to do my garden? In the period between 1918 and the turn of the millennium, compulsory secondary schooling had been introduced and become commonplace for male and females. The grammar school secondary modern school division had been developed and then, thankfully, set aside, and the comprehensive education system had been introduced. My generation was that of the grammar school, though as I moved to and through universities, the comprehensive school had been established, as had the polytechnics. These in 1992 were converted into universities, but they were converted without disrupting the nature of traditional universities, or the culture or identity of traditional universities. It seemed a natural thing to do, to allow the polytechnics the dignity of the title university, to free them from financially impoverished control of the local authorities, which had happened just prior to them becoming universities, and put their funding under the higher education funding councils, together with that of the traditional universities, who that funding council currently funded. This led, in my view, firstly to a failure to ask the question, what is a university? Secondly, it produced a mission drift with the former polytechnics in their desire, their forced desire, to follow the money and the prestige of what was introduced, which was a research assessment exercise. This research assessment exercise was introduced by the established existing order, the traditional universities, or at least their influence. The RAE, as it's called, ensured that the traditional universities could continue to operate according to their elitist class system, as they had done from their 19th century foundation. The RAEs, therefore, thereby reimposed a culture which defined the university in the following terms. The better the research, the better the intake, the better the university. It's a measure still used by governments, by the press, by the media, and the aspirational middle class. You will recall L.C. Knight's on Shakespeare. The finer the language, the finer the play. But that mantra was the culmination of 19th century movements which faded fast in the mid to late 20th century. What we are coming to is an assumption that research is the defining nature of the quality of a university in a historical sense. That is not so. That is not so. Mantras do not go down to the same measurement of great literature, nor the major issues of social justice or of educational practice. Indeed, some would argue, perhaps with Leighton Andrews, and myself among them, that the universities in Britain promote a narrow identity and show themselves to be the last bastion still of a middle class, of a class system. Even in the 19th century, when John Newman wrote his treatise on the idea of the university, he did not consider research to be a defining principle. Indeed, his view was that research was seen to be better catered for through the Royal Institutes, the Royal Societies and academies that had been founded mainly in the 18th century. It is untrue that Newman thought that research was the defining element of a university. What has made research the defining element of the university has been the universities of the 20th century in England. And they do it very cleverly because they give the impression that that has always been the case. So let's go back and have a look at the original universities. Let's go back to even before Shakespeare and to the universities that were founded in the 13th and 14th century in Italy, in the Italian states. These universities were developed to help the creation of wealth. The Renaissance universities were created for economic reasons. I'm afraid they were developed for the male population. but it was so that the male population could make money for the city. And they were very successful. So successful was the one in Florence, for example, that in the mid-15th century, 1460s, a lawyer, whose name was Otto Nicolini, reports that there was a big debate in the city. And the debate was like this. We have become so wealthy here in Florence that we don't need a university anymore. We can do it without. So why don't we close the university? What's the point? Let's close it. We got all the wealth we want, got lovely pictures, we got all the culture we want, we can execute a few people outside Santa Croce every now and again. We're all right. Let's close it. And do you know what? They did. They closed it and they transferred it to Pisa. The University of Firenze that we know of today, for nearly 100 years, wasn't at Florence. It was recreated when Florence started to go down. And so when people say Leonardo didn't go to university, he couldn't. There wasn't one in Florence at the time. It had been closed. So perhaps there was no need for universities after all. So, this leads me to doubt that when Owen Glendower, in the Penal Letter 1406, a facsimile of which we have in the Creative Industries building, one of only 6 facsimiles in the world of it, when in 1406 he petitioned the King of France not merely to help him in his revolt against Henry Bolingbroke, but to help establish 2. I am suspicious that he had in mind that they were research-based universities. I am just a little suspicious. Newman didn't want research-based universities. That's not what universities are for. And the Italian city-states didn't want research-based universities. They wanted wealth-creating universities. Universities for jobs. The concept of the research-led university is a 20th century phenomenon. Possibly Glendower had the pragmatic type of university there in his mind to help drive the economic development, to help promote social cohesion in a country which had been devastated by civil war against Henry Bolingbroke, or caused by Henry Bolingbroke. The historical Glendower, of course, was as much a scholar as a soldier, accomplished in the law. He had studied at the Inns of Court, a practical university, teaching practical lawyers. He spoke 4 languages: Welsh, English, French, and Latin. At school, he would have learnt Latin through the medium of French. And having been in the civil service at the court of Richard II, he was a diplomat as well. We know he was a landowner cheated by the English, and a person who, as Iolo Goch testifies, appreciated poetry and music and was amiable and hospitable. The Welsh poet Iolo Goch describes him as a hardy and valiant, the best of Britons, a tall, handsome, accomplished gentleman. Nevertheless, Glendower became a considerable foe to a self-crowned King Henry IV in Westminster, who Glendower as a lawyer may well have argued had usurped the throne and would probably have been right. Shakespeare writes of Glendower, or Glendower, as he calls him, into one of his plays, Henry IV, Part 1. When we call this university Glendower, somebody, I won't say who, somebody met me in the Palace of Westminster, and he said, "So you're naming a university after a ruffian and a scoundrel?" I don't know whether that person could speak Latin, French, Welsh, and English. I certainly can't. And I doubt if many people in this room can. I don't think that person had been trained at the Inns of Court. But of course, we have a view about the man. Shakespeare writes of him around 200 years after Glyndwr's death, if, of course, Glyndwr ever died, because we don't know. But we presume he might have done. Glyndwr, Shakespeare writes about him in Henry IV, Part 1. And critics and commentators tend to quote Glendower's bombast as representative in a speech where Glendower asks leave to tell you once again that at my birth the front of heaven was full of fiery shapes, the goats ran from the mountains, and the herds were strangely clamorous to the frightened fields. These signs have marked me extraordinary, and all the courses of my life do show I am not in the roll of common men. The Northumberland rebel, Hotspur, can't take this kind of bombast. And he puts such wild dramatics down by his answer to Glendower's, "At my nativity the front of heaven was full of fiery shapes, of burning cressets, and at my birth the frame and huge foundation of the earth shaked like a coward." Hotspur puts him down with these words. Why, so it would have done at the same season if your mother's cat had kittened, though you yourself had never been born. And often critics just leave it at that. It's nice, isn't it? Puts the Welshman down. But there's another character on stage. His name is Mortimer. Because there were three rebels: Glyndwr of Wales, Mortimer of the Marches, and Hotspur of Northumberland. And Mortimer puts Hotspur down. He says this: "In faith, he is a worthy gentleman, exceedingly well read, and profited in strange concealments, valiant as a lion, and wondrous affable, and as bountiful as mines of India. Shall I tell you, cousin, he holds your temper in high respect, and curbs himself even of his natural scope when you come cross his humour. Faith he does, I warrant you, that a man is not alive might so have tempted him as you have done, without the taste of danger and reproof. But do not use it oft, let me entreat you." He's a man who's also shown patience. Often a neglected speech. And here again, what have we got with this incident? We've got contradictory and complementarity. The contradictions and complementarities that you have in life, of people, of you, of me. The things that contradict our characters. The nanoparticles in that mixture which makes you or me the individual that we are, with our frailties and our strengths, whoever we are. And it's this that Shakespeare has put forward in fiction. But it's this that a university puts forward in reality. You and me. And what we are. Glyndwr's father-in-law, Hanmer, is actually buried in Gresford Church. It's on the left-hand side, left-hand nave. You see the effigy of him as a lawyer. his father-in-law, buried in Gresford Church during the Great Revolt. There is no record, but little doubt, that Glyndŵr was born less than 20 miles from this campus, and that at times, surely, he would have visited the parish church in Gresford, his father-in-law's estates with across Fly, and surely he would have visited the parish church here in Wrexham, both there. And interestingly, neither of them sacked by Glyndŵr during the wars, kept intact. The land of his former estate, which was destroyed by the English at Sycharth, is currently owned by a student of this university who actually graduates this year. Glyndŵr is the contradictory man who was the first person as being recorded to have wished to establish a university in North Wales. He saw, I believe, the university as an agent of education, and in that I would like to think also of economic development and social cohesion. Now let me move to pull all this material together into a conclusion about the future of the university. Let me say, before doing so, that certain announcements are going to be made tomorrow about this university, and I'm not going to make those announcements tonight. So, sorry if you're disappointed. Let me say also that when I tell you that, I'm smiling. So the announcements tomorrow that I might be making, or that the chairman who's here, thank you for coming, that the chairman here will be making, are taking us along a particular road, which is for the best, we believe, for the university here in Wrexham. First, in drawing these conclusions. First, there are intellectual parallels between the development of trends in Shakespearean criticism and the development of education. The latter is a bit slower than the former, and these actually have a personal interest for me, in which I've indulged tonight. Secondly, that just as certainties of Shakespearean criticism, in which I am academically engaged, have been challenged in the latter part of the 20th century and the opening decade of the 21st century, so it is time to challenge the certainties of what we now consider to be the defining features of universities. Thirdly, when Owen Glyndŵr called for the founding of a university, it is possible that he was not considering an institution dedicated to research, but rather one necessary for social cohesion and prompting economic development following a time of civil upheaval and war, and in the tradition of the founding universities in the Italian states. Fourthly, that it is necessary to stand back from the accretion of constructed notions about what a university is and actually ask the questions. What is a university? What are they for? How should they be organised in 21st century Wales? My answers are as follows. What is a university? A university is an award-granting body for education. It has the ability to grant awards, particularly, but not solely, degrees. And that is what distinguishes a university at its root from other educational organisations such as schools, colleges and institutes. That is what characterises its identity in the educational activity in which it then engages. A university is an award-granting body, full stop. That's a distinguishing feature. And then it uses that to characterise its identity in the educational activity in which it chooses to engage. So the only permanent thing, if anything can be permanent, is that it's an award-granting body. But even that could be changed by government. No government has yet changed that in Britain, ever. But Florence did. by transferring it to another place, to the west, to Bangor, Pisa. Freud. What are universities for? Obviously, they're there to award qualifications. But after that, we have to deconstruct the ambiguities surrounding universities, as we had to deconstruct a Shakespeare play. And we deconstruct them for our own time. And in that, we find contradictory and complementary levels, leading us to become involved in meanings not necessarily related to the question being superficially asked. Just as we do so in Shakespearean studies, we ask the question. Contradictory and complementary levels. Despite Newman, some universities are principally concerned with pure research. And I'm the first person to say that our universities of Oxford and Cambridge are the greatest universities in the world, or amongst the greatest universities in the world. They're very few, and nobody should ever tamper with Oxford and Cambridge in their mission. And with them, there are others, like London School of Economics, Imperial, so on. The great universities. But Oxford and Cambridge are supreme in what they do. In what they do. Some, in line with Newman, are principally concerned with the education of the whole person, of knowledge for its own sake. Some, like the original Italianate universities, are primarily related to wealth and job creation, though all have a mixture of each other. But the principal identities are there. So how should they be organised in 21st century Wales? First of all, we should not revert to a grammar school, secondary modern school model. There should be a complementarity and parity of esteem between the university that looks towards pure research as its defining principle and the university that looks towards jobs, wealth creation and social cohesion as its primary purpose. Instead of having league tables, which is vertical ladder with Oxford and Cambridge at the top and the University of Bloxwich at the bottom, doesn't exist, that's why I put it there. University of Bloxwich at the bottom. You've got to turn that ladder and make it a horizontal. And along the horizontal you have to have peaks. You can have the peak of Oxford and Cambridge and you've got to protect it. But you can have the peak of Glyndŵr and that peak can be as high as that peak in what Glyndŵr does. In bringing people who have never been to university or their communities have never sent people to university into university. By creating the wealth of the region, by helping that economic development through partnering with industry and commerce, by working with the local authority, by working with the government in order to promote social justice, equality, and a parity of esteem between that peak and that peak. Both universities, both fruit. That's an apple, that's a pear. And I have to tell you that my experience in Oxford last year was that the Oxford dons, on the whole, respected Glyndŵr University and what we were doing and showed a real interest in it. And I respected and was honoured by the fact that I'd been elected to an Oxford college as a visiting fellow. It is the failure of the parity of esteem elsewhere that we've got to tackle. That's down there with the nanoparticles. Equality in funding is the most fundamental challenge to government in its reform of universities. if it is serious about the need for true widening participation, economic development and social cohesion. It is the failure of the equity of funding and the failure of a parity of esteem which causes division and undermines government policies themselves. We're now down beneath the surface. We're down to where things are moving. In my view, there are too many universities in the UK that still define themselves according to the 20th century traditional norm of research. And nobody says it. So I'm saying it. There are too many of them. Far too many of them. And they're not doing the country a service by defining themselves in those terms. But give them their due. They're doing that because the funding councils, the press, the media, and governments have constructed a language whereby these are promoted as the top universities. Nonsense. Nonsense. Because we take students from communities that would not have normally gone to universities, does that mean that our students don't get good jobs? Our students leaving here get well above the average salary, as shown by the Sunday Times, when they go into jobs. And more of our students, than the average, actually get jobs within 6 months or go on to further study. 94.7% of them. National average is down to something like 88%. But you're not a top university. It's the language. It's the preconceptions. And it's reinforced by funding regimes, by government, and by press, and by middle-class aspirations. So, this anomaly, promoted linguistically and financially, has to be deconstructed. We have to deconstruct the political and popular notions of research university as having a primacy. Such a definition is historically invalid and contemporarily dangerous for the survival of the functions required of a vocational, applied research, community-based university focused on wealth, social cohesion, economic development, and social justice. The reforms which Leighton Andrews, the Minister for Education and Skills in the Welsh Government, calls for nationally demands such a deconstruction of the popular conception of a university. But the smoke and mirrors resistance to that call is palpable and intense in its opposition, but not by this university, because this university is the victim, along with lots of others, of a historical situation caused as much by government and funding councils and the press as anything else. The Shakespearean disciplines of coming to terms with contradiction and complementarities in discovering meanings and interpretation simultaneously has allowed me the transfer technology of my subject learning into an interpretation of the purpose of Glyndŵr University, named after an iconic figure made famous to the world, particularly by Shakespeare, more than anyone else. Now, however, through this university's global reach from its Welsh locality here in Wrexham and the northeast of Wales, we are making him and his vision known even more by recreating a pragmatic type of university fit for purpose, student-centred, market-led, internationally significant and open to all. Glyndŵr University is our university. Glyndŵr University is your university. It's dedicated to its students and its clients of this region, of this town. It's an indispensable partner in the economic and social development of this region and this town and this country, and of any country that asks us to go there to help them. From Shakespeare to Glyndŵr University, That has been my postmodernist journey tonight, but it's also been my postmodernist journey throughout my professional life. As a teacher, a writer, an administrator, and latterly a Vice-Chancellor, very proud to serve this university and the people of North East Wales. Thank you for listening. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you. Yeah.
I'll say something later. But first, there's time for just a couple of questions, I think. Anyone dying to ask him a question of anything at all, provided it's related to this? Anyone? Yeah? Well, if not, Michael, I will ask one. You gave that lovely image of deconstructing by throwing a pot to the floor, it picks up into little shreds, you get all the little shreds, and you rebuild it. The last 10 minutes or so was about rebuilding a different kind of institution. And you've given us some idea of the kind of shape of it. But why do you want to keep the same shape for Oxbridge?
There is a difference in my view between applied research and pure research. There's a difference in my view between a university that, in order to be able to be as fit for purpose as the Welsh rugby team is at the moment, they need that dedication of research within the university itself. When I was at Oxford, you get a whole lot of kind of misconceptions about Oxford, you know, coming from Evelyn Waugh and all the rest of it, and or even Chariots of Fire, I suppose. But what I found at Oxford was that the lecturers worked incredibly hard, very long hours, were under a huge amount of pressure, and that the students equally worked incredibly hard. I didn't find that there were a bunch of scoundrels there. I found that they were hugely professional, competitive, yes, but absolutely dedicated to the intellectual professions which characterize Oxford, which is related to the research mission of the university, which is pure research. And we need pure research. And they have to do it. If they're going to be good, they've got to do it at that absolute peak. If you take the analogy with the Welsh rugby team, I have not seen any team as fit as they are. It is quite incredible. And if they lose on Saturday, I will be surprised. If they lose in the final, I will be surprised. Because I looked at the All Blacks and I looked at the French, and I'm not a rugby fan, but they ain't as fit as that team. They deserve to win. And why? Because they've really put themselves through it. And I think Oxford and Cambridge people do put themselves through it. However, what they're not good at, although they're getting better at it, is the transfer of technology. And what they're not good at is raising the aspirations of total communities. Now, what we're good at is applied research, of taking on problems that industry gives us. We don't go to business and say, "What's your problem?" You know, we don't go to Toyota and say, "Incidentally, we're going to tell you about lean manufacturing." They invented it. We go and say, "You got lean manufacturing. You're the best people in the world in lean manufacturing. How can we help you disseminate that with our other industrial partners? How can we do that?" And that's what we do. We don't go to Airbus and tell Airbus how to make a composite wing. You know, it's ridiculous for us even to contemplate that. But we go to Airbus with our colleagues from Deeside College and say, you the guys who've got something that you want to be making, that you know what you want to be making it, you tell us how you want us to teach your students in order that they're the right people to make it. And that's what we do, Deeside College and ourselves, in probably the best foundation degree in the whole of the UK. But it's not recognised or lauded as that because we happen to be in Wales. If we were 6 miles the other way, along the border, both Deeside and ourselves, we'd be in all the press as the best complementarity that there's been in creating a foundation degree. So I say, they're apples, we're pears. I like apples, I like pears. I like pears better.
In which case we are a pair. The time is pressing on, and I know that afterwards there'll be a chance to perhaps ask questions directly to Michael. So let me just say, if I may, in conclusion, it is wonderful, isn't it, to be able to have a Vice-Chancellor who can profess, he is a professor, and to profess his belief, bred of proper academic study, continuing academic study, as I said at the start, in a field far from the kind of nature of this kind of institution in English literature, to have maintained that, to be able to deconstruct analytically. A professor should be able to do that in any chosen field. But to transfer that skill, again what universities are about, transferability of skill creation, to transfer that ability to deconstruct, to throw it down, and then to build up and say, hang on, and to challenge, because then from the deconstruction comes this new vision, the radicalism of a Glyndŵr, and of many others like. And isn't that precisely what's needed at this time, here in Wales, certainly throughout UK as well, but here particularly, where a time to think afresh. A new university should be thinking new ideas, not to be frightened of the past, as Michael said. That's brilliant. So we are really fortunate in having this academic who can transfer the ability, can make the pair come really, really beautifully blossoming, and above all, to be an inspiration. I think that you've seen something of that tonight. We all have. And we've also seen another side of Michael that many have probably not seen, which is, if ever he'd not been an academic, he would have been a good actor. So, on behalf of us all here, and I'd want to say for the university as a whole, for the leadership you are giving, bred of a clear understanding of history, of being able to interpret contradictions, to be able to make something new, we're all immensely grateful and immensely proud. And I know that the announcement that will be made tomorrow will make everyone in this room proud that we are standing for something different, for something real, that will be a peak on a horizontal line that he's taught of. And that peak, in its own way, will be measured at the same height as that dreadful place called Oxford and Cambridge.
Can I just say thank you very much, everybody, for coming. And thank you. I was really pleased so many wanted to come, and so many good colleagues who worked with me. I know it's cost you a fortune. It's going to cost you a fortune later in the bar, I can tell you that, Sharon. All right. Cheers. Thank you very much.